you been unleashed?
Unleashed.
Unleashed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Horizon Advisors Unleashed podcast. This is Andrew Henricks back here again for a fun and exciting part two. Joining with me also from part one, Ryan Cuss. What's going on, Ryan?
Howdy.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Excited to have another great chat. You know, I think actually after when I was thinking about part one before we did this one too, I really just wanted to elaborate real quick on like how important I think this topic really is. Even though it's more of like a conceptual type of topic, obviously there's a lot of facts and stuff that are backing up to it. But just thinking about this question a lot and how frequently, I know we spoke about that in the first one, but how frequently this topic is brought up. It's actually way more than I even thought after talking the first one. And I just really think it's an important topic. I'm excited to chat again on part two.
I mean, it's all you can see. I mean, if I get another darn text message, I don't know how they're allowed to just text me without my permission. I mean, how many are you getting a day right now?
Oh, from the political, like, yeah.
The polls and stuff.
Yeah,
I'm getting like 5 a day right now.
Trump needs you, Harris needs you, Obama needs you, Harris needs you, Reagan needs you. They're still, I mean, they're going all the way back.
Washington still needs you.
People that I don't even know need me. They're pulling from every which way. Yeah, a lot. I am getting a lot. Now that you say that, I'm like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of texts. I don't even know how you can get my number from probably anywhere.
I mean, with our regulations, we have to have people opt in to be getting those texts, and I guess the politicians, they just do it.
And it has to be recorded and everything, too. You can't just, text. It has to be a recorded, approved software, too. Yeah, how do they even, well, that's another topic for another day. But going further back, part one and part two, we are at part two. Welcome back. Again, exciting topic, big topic, important topic, all the above. If you did listen to part one, just a reminder, we are referencing a presentation by Brian Levitt, who is the global market strategist with Invesco. And the topic at hand, the subject, the title, people care about elections, markets don't. Welcome back to part two. Let's get it started. And I'm going to lead it off, kind of following how I ended, right? And again, I go back to how I started this podcast, which is just thinking about this subject in its entirety. People care about elections, markets don't, right? So let's just follow up with that theme, follow up with some of these topics that we're discussing, and really showing why this question of what the market's going to do, and I think this is going to happen because this person's getting elected, how there really is a lot of data out there to show that it's actually the exact opposite, which is, again, people care more about it than the markets do. So, next slide, following off part two, here we go. The title of this slide is Obvious, in quotes, politically focused sector industry calls are often wrong. So you look at the slide, and I'll reference and I'll read a little bit in a second, but ultimately the way you can think about this from the title is you might think one sector of business is going to thrive under a certain party for the regulations or maybe some of the things they said and what they support fundamentally, fiscally, et cetera, et cetera. And you might think the opposite of another, right? If one party gets in or one president gets elected, that the other sector that might be contrary to the one that would be favored might underperform or be lagging because of that election, because of that result. And this slide really kind of cleanly puts it right in front of you, which is they use clean energy, right? Which obviously is a very politically talked about topic, right? And really, it's just showing you a very simple chart, right? And then I'm going to read it, but you look at it, and again, if you follow politics and kind of understand maybe one side or the other, which would favor, oil and gas versus maybe clean energy, electric vehicles, solar, et cetera, right? You can kind of guess which one we're leading to. The chart on the left shows how clean energy performed under Trump, which is, you can look at the chart, it actually says clean energy outperformed under Trump. Right? You might think, without looking at this chart, without having the perspective of looking back with hindsight, you would say, oh, when Trump's elected, there's no way that clean energy is going to outperform. There's no way that's going to, because he's going to be favoring oil, gas, other things because of his party, et cetera, et cetera. Well, actually was the exact opposite. Clean energy outperformed under Trump quite drastically, as you can see on the chart to the left. And the other is the opposite, which is how clean energy performed when Biden's administration was in office. You might think, oh, yep, okay, Democrats are now in office. They might favor clean energy. They're going to be trying to pass regulations, bills, laws, et cetera, to favor clean energy. So obviously they're going to, outperform, right? It was actually the opposite. Clean energy underperformed under Biden's administration. So, again, I'll just read it from the slide. Be wary of the obvious, right? That's what we're talking about, obvious sector preferences based on which candidate or party wins the election. For example, based on their agendas, few would have had expected what I just stated, which is clean energy to outperform under Trump and then clean energy to underperform under Biden. So, again, pretty straightforward slide, but just to reiterate the theme again here is that obvious sector, right? If there's something that is so obvious, it's not always the right call. And actually, oftentimes, it's actually often wrong. And this kind of goes to a theme that we're going to see in a couple other slides here today, but also what we spoke about in the last part one, which is when you have a split, political system, House, Congress, the Senate, you talk about bipartisan, one party favors, one party doesn't, that really has a lot more to play with it rather than exactly who's in office, just like the market and some of these other things that we're talking about. Because if one sector is going to, you think would be an obvious outperform or underperform based on who's in office, you got to really look deeper and say, well, are those agendas, do they really have a chance to go through? Do they really have a chance to make something happen? That might actually be the more realistic way to look at it rather than the actual candidate or the actual president that does get elected and who's in office. Because there's a lot more things to play with and a lot more hoops to jump through and laws and the system of our government to go through to pass bills, get things done. It's a lot more complicated than that.
And some of this might even be what the past president spent time and energy in, but it didn't really
Correct.
pass or start getting its legs until the next president's. And so it's to just try to make a decision, tilt your portfolio to a certain direction because of who the next president's going to be could be pretty risky.
And that could be exactly the final and great point that he just made. You might actually look at this chart and say, okay, well, hold on a minute. Maybe it actually makes sense. Maybe because Obama, and his administration was in charge before Trump came in, maybe that's why they outperformed because of the regulations that were done prior to. And then the flip-flop, well, yeah, they underperformed during Biden because maybe what a Trump did, now Biden has to take over, and the things that Trump had did before is what's causing what had happened. You might be able to look at it that way, but the bottom line is looking at it the way today, when you ask the question today, it's not as clear-cut as you might seem, and it's often wrong.
Great. The next slide we're taking a look at, and by the way, we're also doing this with video. So if you do want to see the video, it'll be on YouTube, and these slides will be part of the video, so it could make more sense looking at it that way also. This slide is called U.S. Economy Isn't Radically Re-Engineered. Again, U.S. economy isn't radically re-engineered, even under a single-party rule. If you think of any presidencies, especially if you just are in the office for one term, a lot of times you have a lot of things to grapple with just in your first year, just getting your hands wrapped around, what needs to be done, what you're going to do, what you're going to change. So if you're a one-term president, how much can you really change in a term? That's questionable. That's not really what this slide is about. What this slide is about is it's looking at, the Congress, and if it's a single party rule, meaning they have the House, the Senate, and the president, versus each party, and then on the graph, it's also showing a divided, kind of like what we have right now, where one party's in the House, one party's in the Senate, and then you have a party under for the president. Uh, Very rarely does it all, kind of roll up to just being all Republican or all Democratic. We have seen it in the past, but typically you see the splits, and I think the economy, performs better, during these divided governments. It's kind of what you want. Like if you're just all one-sided looking at things, through kind of one lens, that might not be the best thing. If you have multiple opinions from both sides, debating, figuring out what the best way to do it is, and you can bring all that together and actually get movement, that's a lot of times where the best ideas are made. So the one chart that I kind of like here is the percent of substantive bills per congressional term. So how many bills were passed, and it shows with red dots, when it was a single rule party for Republicans. With the blue dots, it's showing the single party rule for Democrats, and then the I guess unfilled circle, is a divided government. And when you look at this chart, and it really only goes back 30 years, so it could go further, it could look different in different time periods, but this is basically, going from Bill Clinton to the, Trump administration. And when you look at, all the single party rules, if you draw a line, you almost could draw a straight line across the bills that each party has passed. I mean, they're almost identical. Most of the outliers, the spikes, in either direction, and most of the direction is above, getting more bills passed, is really during a divided government. So, I think this is, pretty interesting. A lot of people, because when you listen to these debates, you watch these commercials, all this noise is happening around you. It's very easy to get concerned about, maybe one subject or two subjects, but, the government, the U.S. is much more complicated than that. And really, when you think of most time periods, I mean, I'm 44. I've seen a few time periods while following politics. You don't really see much change at the end of the day.
Not a lot of the time. Again, there's a lot of things on both sides. Again, being completely neutral here, there are a lot of things that get talked about and then blown kind of out of proportion in the media about it happening or not happening, and it ends up not happening. Or very, very different. Maybe it does end up happening, but very minuscule or very minute compared to what the actual big agenda was at first or what was discussed at first. And it might not happen for a long time, right? Just because it's happened, it gets discussed right now, it might not happen for 1, 2, 3, maybe even at the end of the term, right? So there's always that noise, and this kind of data, again, really puts the proof to the pudding of what is actually going on. And I think the kind of final thing to this point, too, to just remind you all, is the market normally and often is forward-looking. Yes, there can be times where the market is reactive in terms of what's going on today or what's going on right now has an impact. But often it's forward-looking. It's looking at what's going on today and then what do they think the impact will be in the future. So a lot of the time, when you look at this exact chart, the market's actually probably going to feel whatever positive or negative long-term effect, probably would feel that maybe a little bit later rather than right this second or right this day when that agenda or that bill or whatever is getting discussed. Because again, it's not really going to feel that until they actually see the clarity of if that bill is going to pass and if it's actually going to go through. So it's just interesting to note. And
stuff takes time, and that's what people don't realize. Just because you enact something or you put something in place, I mean, as an example, Obama put in Obamacare, the new health insurance that's still here today. Well, everybody remembers when that first launched, it was a disaster. The
Mm-hmm.
website wasn't working, nothing
Yep.
really worked well. And then over time, everybody gets together and says, hey, yeah, we do want better health care for the U.S. And,
Mm-hmm.
everybody works together to try to get that better and better. And now, I don't know if it's in a better place than it was. I don't really feel the difference
I think so.
personally,
Yeah.
but I know not having, the pre-existing conditions, some of the things that were kind of rough with the old healthcare system, seem to be better, seem to be, a little more liberal. I mean, if someone has a health condition that they couldn't help,
Mm.
they shouldn't really be penalized for it. So, but that's a great example. I mean, that over the last, 10, 15 years, if you think about big changes, I mean, that was a really big one. I think it took, it might have took 5, 10 years to really, start feeling that.
Well, yeah, and the website and all the technology and stuff that was enacted definitely is better now. But that's just been the time, that has been invested to it to fix it, make it better, and make it more accessible, and all the above, right? So that just comes with time. So certainly a good point. So the next slide is titled, Neither Party Can Claim Fiscal Responsibility. Concerns are likely overstated. Now, when we talk about fiscal responsibility, and again, if you're looking at the presentation, you can kind of see it at the chart. I'll just reference the bottom first before I kind of read this. It's talking about federal outlays as a percentage of GDP. That's the darker blue, or like the black kind of colored line. And then there's the lighter blue, or kind of like the royal bluish, and it's called federal receipts, or as a percentage of GDP, which would be like the inlays, right? So federal outlays is like federal spend, federal expenditures. Federal receipts are things like taxes, right? Things that are coming in to the government, right? Almost like accounts receivable in a way, right? It's the money coming in versus the money going out as spent. So before I talk about the chart, I'll kind of just read here. It says, federal spending has outpaced taxes and other sources of government revenue, okay, so federal receipts, in most years and across most administrations. No party can claim fiscal responsibility. It hasn't been a significant issue for a variety of reasons, including the U.S. having the world's largest reserve currency and nominal economic growth, outpacing the interest expense as a percent of gross domestic product, GDP. Okay, so if I take a stop there and I go over to the chart, and you look at the darker line, the dark blue line, and the light blue line, and you see kind of the where they interlapped, right, where they meet each other. There's a couple points where it's closer, but there's really only one time throughout this chart, going all the way back to Kennedy, where it actually, the accounts receivable, the federal receipts, right, what's coming in, taxes, other sources of revenue, are actually higher or outpace the spend. And that's around the 1997 to through 1999 to kind of like 2001 during Bill Clinton's era. Again, you could sit there and say, okay, was that from the regulations and things and everything that was put in place before him, and then he entered, and that's kind of why that happened? And then what he did caused the next, which is the receipts fall drastically. Obviously, there was the dot-com bubble. There was a lot of things going on at that time, 9/11, the very unfortunate terrorist attack on our country, right, which you can kind of see then the drop where about the federal spend, right, goes back up above the receipts. But the bottom line is disregarding the politics, disregarding the pictures and the presidents and everything across the board, the only little at a time is all the way going back to 67, 68, 1967, 68, where maybe for a split second there, the federal receipts outpaced the spend. For the most part, and looking at every other candidate here across the board, the federal spend outpaced pretty significantly the federal receipts, which is what's coming in. So that's why when you talk about the federal spend and obviously the national debt being as high as it is, obviously is a very common subject also that gets talked about. But concerns are likely overstated, which is going back to the title. And again, it's because if you just take away the colors, and when I mean colors, I'm talking about Republican and Democrat, the red and the blue. If you take that away and you just look at the pictures and you look at the lines on the chart, there's a pretty common theme. Yes, there might be some spikes here or there, but there's really only, an outlier on the receipt side one time. And then, maybe you could say there's an outlier, in the 2019, 2020 era. But then again, you look at what happened during that time, and that's when the pandemic was going on. Things were shutting down, businesses were shutting down, money was pumped back into the market to try to, make sure the economy stayed alive and people could survive, businesses could survive, et cetera. So that's when you'd have to do a little bit deeper dive into what actually happened during that time to see if there is, some real outliers there. But again, for the most part, bottom line of this chart is no party can claim fiscal responsibility. Most administrations, going back to Kennedy and looking to present, have really kind of done pretty much the same thing, barring a couple outliers. The last thing it charts here is it just says currently interest outlays as a percentage of GDP are below 2%, which is a low bar for growth to surpass. Again, so just summarizing really everything here, concerns are likely overstated. Neither party can really truly claim the federal spend versus the federal receipts.
Nobody is really bringing that deficit. I mean, you look at that deficit that, it's growing and growing on a daily every second it's growing with the interest. Nobody's really putting a dent into that. Mm-hmm. And, if you have really strong GDP, maybe you can overcome some of that stuff. But eventually, if you run a business that's constantly spending more than is coming in, eventually you're going to have problems.
Yeah, and then this is obviously one of those ones where you could get an economist and political people on this podcast, and they would debate.
And they would shred me.
Yeah, one way or the other on this chart of why those things were to happen. And again, that's their expertise and their job to show and prove why those things happen. But at the end of the day, you look at the chart, and the chart's the chart. And that's the bottom line.
And the national debt is the national debt. This is a great slide. Markets don't care if you don't like who's president. They don't care. I mean, I think we spoke about this in the first podcast is, who the president is really has no impact on who the president is, has no impact on the market. And actually, what's interesting here is it's really more talking about approval ratings with the different presidents. What's pretty interesting, if you look across the chart, there's two charts here. One's the Gallup poll on presidential approval ratings. Most presidents, if you look at their presidency, their approval rating typically starts up higher and ends on a low note. And typically that's why they get replaced. Bush had the sharpest one, I would say. He was kind of medium. He grew his approval rate, but then it just got obliterated, over time. Obama's, his is kind of like a U shape where, his approval rating actually started pretty high and went downhill, for most of it. But then towards the end, his approval rating kind of ticked up. With Trump, if you look at his line, it just kind of stays flat. His approval rating was, maybe a little bit low to start with and kind of just stayed pretty similar along the way. There's a couple just pieces of information here. In fact, most presidents have seen their approval ratings dip below and or persist under 50 during their administrations. Fortunately, markets historically performed the best when a president's approval rating was between 35 and 50. And then in the chart below that, it kind of shows the S&P 500 index, which is the measurement, in how it performed during the different approval ratings. So when approval rating of a president is very low, historically between 20 and 35, the markets don't like that. So the markets don't like a president that, nobody likes, where their approvals are super low, small percentage of people like them. The markets actually performed on average 9.9 negative for low approvals. Then that kind of middle section, that 35 approval rate to 50, the market has averaged 9.3% when you have those medium approval rates. And then maybe when a president's very popular, over 50% of people like that president, the market has done 6.6%. So, I mean, take this information for what it is. I think if you just have a person that, some of the people like, not nobody, but you have a nice chunk, 30 to 50% of people out there, approve of the president, that's where you get the strongest returns in the market.
Yeah, and kind of just to finalize this too, it really just continues the theme again of that bipartisan type of situation, right? If you look at the 35 to 50 approval rating there, you kind of just look at that as, okay, you're in that middle spot where you're like 50% of people don't like, 50% of people do like, right? They approve, they disapprove. And in that kind of split scenario, it outperformed compared to everything else. When people over-like, or the majority of America over-likes in terms of this graph, in terms of this data, likes a president, you would think maybe, maybe the majority of people like it because the economy's booming and all these great things are happening. Well, the market actually, yes, it performed well, but not as best as the best, right? I guess the only really common one you could kind of see, which maybe you can correlate the two, is when people really don't like, right, the majority of people really don't like, that's when the market performed poorly. Maybe that's really the only correlation there. But for the most part is, again, it's about stripping some of the things that you would think, right? Things that you would think would be happening. The easy way to look at it is like what I just said. Oh, if everyone loves the person, probably everything's going great and really, really good. Well, it's not always the case, right? So it's about just looking high level and stripping away all the details of going all the way deep dive into the weeds of all the different things and just looking at the facts, which is right here in front of you.
Yeah, the interesting thing on this chart is, Kennedy actually had a super high approval rate, through his presidency, but Bill Clinton, I think he's the only one on this chart from start to finish ended up with a higher approval rate. And
at the end,
when you think about that, he had a tenure during a very good time in the economy. Whether he made that economy, his government made the economy or not, you got to go way deeper on that.
Mm-hmm.
But just for the facts of looking where we were, as an economy, he ended up, being a liked guy at the end.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us really into the next slide here. So that's a good kind of segue, which is why I'm going to change it up. But it really matters, right? This title is When an Administration Starts Matters. And that kind of leads to kind of what you just said, right? We can look at, if you wanted to dive a little bit deeper, when an administration starts really does matter. And if you remember from part one, right, we mentioned on one of the slides in the beginning when we were looking, I can't remember exactly what graph we were looking at that time, but there was a pretty good correlation on Bush, right, George W. Bush, and his tenure, his 8 years in office, and what had happened with the market at that point from a volatility standpoint and the performance. And you kind of look at what had happened, during when he started, right? Market was going, I think Clinton was before that, or back on that chart, and it's going up above, and then like the .com bubble, right? So all the love and all the positivity of the .com and everything ended, right, with the previous tenure, and then that
severe losses
came to fruition right when he started. So then, boom, you got that, and even with the little bit of what's going on, right, it goes back down. When he ends, he kind of started in a downturn, and then he ended in a downturn with 08,
likes that
right?
guy.
So that's unfortunate, and that goes to the point of, again, when you look at the right-hand side with Barack Obama, right? One of the biggest financial crashes that we've seen, one of the biggest financial crises that we've seen, 08, 09, again, when Bush was kind of ending, then Obama comes in, markets are coming back, things get fixed, and then obviously, the market had one of the best runs following that 3-year span after 08, from like 2011, 2012, all the way through basically 2020, had kind of one of the best runs it's ever seen. So obviously, Barack comes in, he gets at that time, yes, an unfortunate time, but the market returns, very greatly since then. You can kind of look at a lot of things in that scenario, but
It'd be hard not to get the returns when you lose 50%.
correct. And then the other option here too is, again, for Reagan, right? You go back all the way back to the 80s with a lot of the volatility, high interest rate. There was a ton of things going on back then, if you remember. And you look again at how he started, right? Which is, again, not the same, but similar situations. You can, even though they were different situations, you can kind of look at them from a high level, and there is some similarities between these two presidencies on when they started. So again, just kind of this chart is just illustrating that point of what we've kind of discussed throughout this. And, again, it just says is what the Reagan and Obama administrations had in common. Okay, so what I'm just saying, terms began in recessions, like what I just said. Stocks were historically cheap at the time they started, right? So if stocks are historically cheap, but when they start, yes, if they really did a bad job or something really catastrophic happened, maybe they would continue to go down during that presidency. It could happen. But if they're historically cheap at that time, history also says that it's usually going to come back. Doesn't mean that it's for certainty. It's not guaranteed, but that's kind of what this is stating. Another commonality is the Federal Reserve policy designed to restore health to the economy. That was what the policies that were getting in place at that time was. Again, they began in recession. So the recession just happened. Now, Federal Reserve policy is obviously getting designed to try to restore the health of the economy. So, that would say, okay, maybe things are going to return, right? And they finalize it with good demographics, which, from the economic standpoint, were commonalities between the two. So approval ratings, all these things together, when you factor it all in, again, it does matter when the administration starts, right? It's almost like, when you look at any type of situation, let's relate it to sports, for example. If you have a coach, right, in any sport, let's say, he's in charge, she's in charge, and the team, is losing a bunch of games. And
They're the Detroit Pistons.
You got to do the Pistons like that. Come on now.
I know.
Come on now. We love the Pistons. But sure, let's look at the Pistons. You look at a situation where they have the worst year ever for the Pistons on history, right? So you look at the next coach. Even if that coach doesn't have an extraordinary year or the best year ever, right, anything like that, but there's probably a pretty good chance that they're going to improve from what just happened. You would hope, right? And we're talking about the Pistons now.
We are hoping.
But you look at that the same way. If a historical situation happened, yes, you can look at the president before and blame them if you want to. You could go down that road, sure, and there's probably arguments on both fronts of that. But the bottom line is it doesn't matter for the sake of the point I'm making, which is if you start in a situation where you're down, it's been a very bad time, recession, et cetera, and then you come in and your job is to help bring it back, there is still probably a pretty good chance that you're going to improve it to some degree, right? If '08 was one of the worst we've ever seen, probably a good chance you're going to return. Same thing with Reagan back in the 80s. If you're in a recession, we've had a bad time, there's probably a pretty good chance that things are going to be focused on getting that return, and then the data and the performance, everything is going to support that. So, again, high level, stripping away some of the politics and just looking at the data, and that's why I kind of like to relate it to sports because it's the same way. Coach has the worst season ever. He gets fired, she gets fired. You bring in a new coach. The chances are that, yeah, maybe they're not going to have an excellent year, but they're probably going to do better than the year before.
They start building it up.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is a fun slide, and I kind of like ending this podcast because, comparing presidents, comparing time frames, it's tough to do. I mean, it's good to look at this information, but, just looking at the facts and what slide is talking about is the fact that no matter who the president is, there's always opportunity for investment in new opportunities. So when you take a look across, all these different little pictures and different objects, these are innovations since the 2008 election. So 2008, that's 16 years ago. And in that time frame, we've seen cloud computing. I mean, I remember having to have memory sticks and different things that you would have to like store things on. They could go bad. You'd keep your pictures in a shoebox. Cloud computing allowed us to store all this in the space. Tablets, fitness trackers, 3D printing, social media. I mean, think about it. I mean, just that far ago, there wasn't really social media.
I think Facebook was the only one, really.
Ride share. I mean, I remember, when I go out to the bars when I was younger, you'd have to get a taxi or a limo. Now you can just get a ride share. It's super easy. Bionic Eye, a more recent electric cars, autonomous cars. Those are things that are, coming into the future. I don't know how big a markets. I think I just saw Ford recently just kind of, step back off the electric cars, and now they're saying, okay, hybrid's going to be the way to go. Why go all the way to one side when we could have a happy medium that still improves the environment? Probably a smart idea. Virtual meetings and software. I mean, I remember, just pre-COVID, I mean, we were doing maybe 10% of our meetings virtually. And now, some of our clients, they don't even want to drive to the office. I'd say we're running at least 50% of our meetings virtually now. Gene editing, virtual payment systems. I mean, everything's
virtual home assistants, yeah.
And then the last one is AI, which is that's the wild card on this whole chart. I mean, some of that is built into the stock market right now, but we're just at the scratching point of, what AI is going to really mean for us. I mean, what do you think about this?
It again, to say it again, but the theme of this whole conversation, and disregard this podcast for a second. We speak about this all the time, which is when we talk about the president, the presidential election, all these things. Before I talk about this slide specifically, I want to reiterate a common phrase that I say all the time, which is, if you go back to the stock market and you talk about investing in companies, public companies, things of that nature, if you go back to whatever finance class you ever took, even if you took a finance class in high school, 8th grade, college, no matter what, it always starts with that basis of what the role of a company is, a public company. And it'll tell you that it is the primary goal is to bring value to the shareholders. That is the primary goal, to bring value to the shareholders. Now, yes, they have underlying themes, which might be to, do public service and do the right things morally, ethically, religiously, whatever it is. They might
cleaner companies.
Correct. They might have other themes, but at the bottom line is public companies is to bring value to its shareholders. So when you really think about that, really truly think about that, the job of a corporation and the people that are leading those companies and managing those companies, all the way from the employees all the way up to the top management, is to try to make that company profitable, given the environment, given their sector, given the technology that's in place during that time for their business, all those different things. It's to try to make the business profitable and bring value to the shareholders. So when you think about that, yes, there can be legislation, there can be regulations, there can be things that get put in place that can hinder those things, right? Maybe it's higher taxes, maybe it's regulations on their sector that stops them from doing certain things.
More costs to do those.
More costs, all these different things. But at the end of the day, the job of the person in charge and the people in charge of those companies is to navigate those changes, navigate those regulations, those laws, whatever it is, and try to make the business profitable. So companies are always going to be doing that regardless of who is in office, regardless of what party it is. They are going to be trying to do that.
Or they die.
Or the company dies. So that's why I just want to lead with that and kind of end the whole podcast and everything about that, is because when you look at this slide and you talk about what it says on the left, history suggests that innovations and investment opportunities will continue irrespective of who wins a presidential election. all of these things on this slide, all of these technologies, all these new things are still going to be happening. Things are still going to be innovative. New technology is going to come out. New businesses are going to come out to solve new problems, new things that we don't even know about right now even, right? We talk about AI and some of these other things. If you went back to 2008 and spoke about AI and electric cars and all these things coming to the fruition of what it is today, you would have no idea. If we did this podcast 15 years ago, we would have no idea, no perspective of any of these things, and that's the whole point, is exactly that. These things are going to happen. They're going to come to fruition regardless of who is in office and regardless of who the president is. That's the bottom line. So, in a summary, to conclude the podcast, and thank you, very much for everyone listening to both parts. Again, I think this subject matter is really important. It's very interesting to look through all this and, again, just kind of strip away the politics for just a second and be neutral from a perspective of looking at the data, which is the high-level data. And you look at these things and say, okay, how do I digest this information? What should I really be caring about? And it goes back to people care about the elections, markets don't. Thank you very much for listening. We enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Ryan Kuss, President and Financial Planner. Alexander Dinzer, Managing Director and Financial Planner. Andrew Henricks, Financial Planner. Securities and advisory services offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA/SIPC, a broker-dealer and registered investment advisor. Cetera is under separate ownership from any other named entity. Tax planning services offered by Horizon Advisors. Tax and accounting services provided by Horizon Advisors CPA. Cetera Advisor Networks does not provide tax nor accounting services. For a comprehensive review of your personal situation, always consult with a tax or legal advisor. Neither Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, nor any of its representatives may give legal or tax advice. The views stated in this podcast are not necessarily the opinion of Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities. Due to volatility within the markets, opinions are subject to change without notice. Information is based on sources believed to be reliable. However, their accuracy or completeness cannot be guaranteed. Past performance does not guarantee future results. Investors cannot invest directly in indexes. The performance of any index is not indicative of the performance of any investment and does not take into account the effects of inflation and the fees and expenses associated with investing. A diversified portfolio does not assure a profit or protect against loss in a declining market. All investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will be successful. Distributions from traditional IRAs and employer-sponsored retirement plans are taxed as ordinary income and, if taken prior to reaching age 59.5, may be subject to an additional 10% IRS tax penalty. Converting from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA is a taxable event. A Roth IRA offers tax-free withdrawals on taxable contributions. To qualify for the tax-free and penalty-free withdrawal of earnings, a Roth IRA must be in place for at least 5 tax years, and the distribution must take place after age 59.5 or due to death, disability, or a first-time home purchase, up to a $10,000 lifetime maximum. Depending on state law, Roth IRA distributions may be subject to state taxes. Investing in mutual funds is subject to risk and loss of principal. There is no assurance or certainty that any investment strategy will be successful in meeting its objectives. Exchange-traded fund and mutual funds are sold by prospectus only. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, and charges and expenses of the mutual fund or ETF carefully before investing. The prospectus contains this and other information about the product. Contact Alexander Dinzer at 5455 Corporate Drive, Suite 306, Troy, Michigan, 48098 or 248-265-6662 to obtain a prospectus, which should be read carefully before investing or sending money. Horizon Advisors, 5455 Corporate Drive, Suite 306, Michigan, 48098.